Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the CUNY Graduate Center. I'm Karen Sander, the Director of Public Programs, and we are so pleased to have you here tonight, both of in-person audience and for those of you who are Zooming in from all over the world, for what promises to be a fascinating conversation on a very important topic, especially here in New York City, safety and security. Setha and Mark Maguire have put together some new ideas and research in their book, Trapped: Life Under Security Capitalism and How to Escape It, and they will share it with us tonight. Here at the CUNY Graduate Center, our faculty and students are constantly doing research and coming up with new ideas on ways to think about important societal issues. We have over 50 doctoral programs and master's programs here and support 30 centers and institutes who help bring important knowledge to the public. Now, for tonight's program, we're going to have a conversation with our panel, and then around 7:30, we will turn it over to the audience for questions. And after the Q&A, our speakers will be out front signing the book if you'd like to get a copy of it. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Starting on our far left, Mark Maguire is a professor in Maynooth University's Department of Anthropology in Ireland. His research explores counterterrorism, mass casualty events, and special forces operations. He has carried out ethnographic research with police and security agencies in numerous jurisdictions from Europe to East Africa. Next is Setha, who is a renowned anthropologist and environmental psychologist, whose pioneering work explores the relationship between people and built environments, particularly focusing on public spaces and urban plazas. As Distinguished Professor of Environmental Psychology, Geography, and Anthropology here at the City University of New York Graduate Center, she has authored numerous influential books, including On the Plaza and Spatializing Culture. Lo's research has transformed our understanding of how spatial design impacts social interactions, cultural practices, and community formation in urban settings. And last, our moderator tonight is Alex Vitale, who is a professor of sociology and coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He has spent the last 30 years writing about policing and consults community-based movements, human and civil rights organizations, and governments internationally. Professor Vitale is the author of City of Disorder: How the Quality of Life Campaign Transformed New York Politics, and The End of Policing. His academic writings on policing have appeared in many journals, and he's also a frequent essayist whose writings have been published in places like the New York Times, Washington Post, and The Guardian. He has also appeared on CNN, MSNBC, PBS, and The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. So I turn the panel over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see these kinds of public programs at the Graduate Center, where I was actually a student first. So I've been affiliated with this institution for longer than I would care to say. Thanks so much for inviting me to first review the book when it was a manuscript, and I've gotten to read it a few times and to be part of this conversation. So at first glance, I wouldn't necessarily put your two CVs together on a project. So how did you become collaborators? How did this project take form? Did you think it was going to be a book project from the beginning? And use the mics here.
The mic. Oh, my phone is deciding it's going to talk back. Is it on?
Yep.
It was on.
Just hold it close.
Yeah, fine. Let's see, how did it all start? I know that a lot of the graduate students here really like to hear about how books get born. Really, it seems so. This is for you, actually, more than for anyone else. And first, I do want to thank Karen, and I want to thank Alex and Mark. Mark flew all the way from Ireland. Alex came all the way uptown to be with us. But this is a really special occasion, particularly for me, and I'm very appreciative that you're here in the Graduate Center, which means a lot to me. I think it all started when I invited Mark to be on the panel at the American Anthropology Association, maybe 10 years ago. And I was working on gating, and I had been working on gating for a really long time, and I began to be interested in securitization. And I heard about, from a colleague, this European colleague who was doing all this stuff. He wrote a book, or put together a book called The Anthropology of Security, I think is probably, that was published in when? You've got to use that, 2014. So I heard about that, and I said, I think we'll come, and he came. And I don't know, it was, we just really clicked, and we were very, very different in our interests. And the first thing we tried to do, I think, is we decided we would do an edited book together. Again, to the graduate students in the audience, sometimes it's really nice, if it's a new field, to just bring together a whole group of people and do an edited book and see. And so Mark and I together did what's called a Winter Gren. We did a day-long symposium, and then we did this book called Spaces of Security. And when it was all done, I thought that was over, but I don't know what happened.
We were in Germany at the same conference.
Yeah.
And we started chatting, and everybody else around us got bored and started chatting amongst themselves.
We started
and
walking, I remember.
started
Yeah.
leaving, yeah. And then a napkin and a pen was produced, and a book was born on a small white napkin in Germany.
We really do very different work, but we both had the same passion, which was that people really were afraid. People really are afraid that it's real, that it's palpable, all right? That this was not just not important. But two, that it isn't just top down. I know you know this, Alex, but that we both really wanted to show that people themselves, particularly the middle class, which is what we really are focusing on in this book, is we're focusing on middle class, mostly white, but not necessarily white, but middle-class folks, and how their fears, in fact, are creating a world, or our fears, I would, maybe if I dare to include you in this, our fears are creating a kind of world that's really getting harder and harder to live in, and that everyone thinks it's always outside and out there, and we both were really committed to trying to write something that was readable, that was clear, that would explain how our everyday lives get caught up in this web of fear and insecurity, and why it made a difference. And that we agreed on.
And to your credit, it's not just about a white middle class, and it's not just about the United States. This is an international project, and you open the book with a horrific vignette in Nairobi, Kenya, in which you recount this horrific terrorist attack at a shopping mall that was designed precisely with this idea of protecting middle-class shoppers. So how does that vignette tell us about these feelings of insecurity, which are real, and also the limitations of this kind of fortress mindset?
Sure. So just to maybe illustrate a little bit about my work and how it intersects with Setha's as I answer that. So I tend to do projects that are much closer to police, to security services. Not that I get away with quite a bit of criticism, which is a lucky thing. But in that instance, I was working on a project that was reconstructing terrorist attacks from the perspective of the public, so how the public behave. And Westgate was one of the more horrifying attacks in the last 20 or 30 years. From those of you who may have heard something about it or have a vague idea, it is often presented as a multi-day attack when Al-Shabaab group, basically militants, entered Westgate, this very Western shopping mall in the middle of Nairobi, and just massacred people. And then there was a counter-assault by the police and by the military, which went rather badly wrong. Most of those details are actually wrong. It was a much longer attack. Many of the dead were never counted because they were simply workers. You know, they were just put in the back of a car and put somewhere. And an awful lot rested on the arrival of Western mercenaries, for want of a better term. Particularly a guy I know extremely well. A lot of mercenaries are Irish, I'm so sorry. But we're one of our chief exports, along with whiskey, until recently. So really, I tried to interview lots of people that were in this very particular area, and as your question points to, the most obvious thing was that this was a kind of a temple to consumerism. It was supposed to be protected. It was an interior world, as we would argue in the book. And so in some ways, the full horror of when things go wrong, the feeling that there must be somebody there to protect you, all of those things are there, but also this other twist, which is that we have developed in our societies around the world these bubbles, these interior worlds, and when something bad happens, it comes from the exterior. It's almost unimaginable, unintelligible. There's no sense of the civil war that drove that. Everything is pushed to the exterior of these inner kind of temples of consumerism. And the couple that I talk about, I mean, I guess for me, it was a difficult choice as an opening vignette, because it is absolutely horrifying. And I spared the readers most of the details, to be quite honest. But as a couple, I sat with them outside their home 5 years afterwards. And for me, they somehow captured that tension. They were perfectly willing to talk about the inequalities of Nairobi, and they talked about their privilege and used that kind of language we use these days. But at the same time, they were in love with security. They had a love affair with it. They had to have it. It was a sign of their status. It was much more than simply protection. And I think it may be a difficult read as an opening of a book, but it somehow brought together many of the themes that frankly were on our napkin. And we were faithful to our napkin in Germany as this process unfolded.
In many of your case studies, there are these stories of people like, struggling to find some kind of risk-free future. And how does this, in a way, unachievable aspiration set them up for the backside of your story, which is all the unintended negative consequences of this kind of security capitalism that you describe?
Yeah. I was going to say, one of the things, and I don't actually know, Alex, how you feel about Beck and his Risk Society, but I've always felt that there's some sense in a book that was written about the Risk Society that in modern times, there are risks, and there are always risks. And it's just a question of which risk you're willing to take and those that you want to avoid. But what I think that we're beginning to try to see and make clear is what really happens is the risk gets offloaded on some people while other people become, as you're saying, risk averse. It's not so much that it's a class issue, it's a money issue, a wealth issue of trying to find, as Mark uses that word, interiority, but trying to find a place in which you will be completely safe and secure, which has all its pitfalls. But it's at the same time, it's not just that they're risk averse, and it's not just trying to avoid risk, because I think in many ways all of us would like to avoid risk. I think if I interviewed anyone, again, remember we're ethnographers, so we go out and talk. If we talk to anyone, I think people will tell you, I want my children safe, I want my house safe, I want safe streets, whatever. But the issue really is that in some people being risk adverse and creating a world, having the power and the money to create a world that somehow pushes the risk away from them, they are indeed creating a world of greater risk for others. That's sort of how I imagine it.
And there is a twist, if you don't mind interrupting on that. Look, I will freely admit, I have a young child. I'm very risk averse when it comes to my child. I am a helicopter parent. I'm also a lawnmower parent, and whatever metaphor you want to use. But I do obviously know, and a lot of parents will struggle with that the more somebody encounters risk, the more they reduce their fragility, the more they become, frankly, they also become more excited by the world, become more resilient, all that good stuff. But what we also have to recall, and so I want to tack on to what Setha is saying, just as middle and upper middle classes, and especially the wealthy, are becoming more risk adverse and have the power to pay for that, there's a giant sector that's feeding that is just more than willing to sell you some gadgetry that, let's be quite honest, a lot of it doesn't work. The more if it is there, the more it becomes ubiquitous. And it also feeds into status anxiety. Somebody has a secure property and everybody wants a secure property. It's like, was it Gore Vidal that said, you know, when one of my friends does something well, a little bit of me dies? You know, I mean, status does matter, and security is not directly related, in our view, to the supply of risk. It's decoupled. There's
Right.
more going on there.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why we call it security I mean, if you were puzzled by the title, that's why we call it security capitalism. Because what we're really trying to say is this risk-averse kind of society of a certain sector of society, offloading that risk is only creating more and more fear and anxiety and separation and isolation. And we have a whole industry that would like to step in and fill that gap.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that in a second, but just to continue on this point, you know, you have this, this lovely description of a gated community in San Antonio, where my mother lives, and be going in like
Safely.
a week. And so I am familiar with these spaces, and there is a way in which security becomes, in those spaces, the sort of master narrative of their worldview.
That's right.
So that the irony that comes out in these interviews is that as much as they strive for safety, they continuously begin to identify new threats that maybe they would never have identified before.
That's exactly
So that it's a never achievable, so that we've walled off the outside, except now they let workers in to do people's yards and to do, so now they're the threat. And then, oh, even my neighbors drive too fast because the streets are empty and they can, right? So it's this constant invention of threat.
Well, and of course, gated communities, in fact, are no more safe than the surrounding area, which in San Antonio means they're incredibly safe. But of course, outside of the gated communities, there is also no threat. But going in and out of the gates every day, constantly alarming your house, constantly thinking, and I don't know if this is true of your mother. You know, my sister, how this all started with me and the gating is 1992, my sister moved to a gated community in San Antonio, and I couldn't believe it. I was from LA. I just couldn't imagine. And there were alarms and bells and whistles on this house, and you couldn't go outside, nothing. But the fact is, that all reminds you of that you're afraid. And in fact, what people say, I feel so safe and secure, but I wonder if it's really right. That guy could come in behind me. In fact, Joel and I were just in the Doral in Florida, and we drove into a gated community, and we got in following another car, which is what people absolutely worry about in these that I'd interviewed. So the fact of the matter is, the more you securitize your life and the more those walls and gates and guards, absolutely, how can you say, they make your life all about fear rather than less about fear. And so as the fear grows, then you want more security, you buy more gadgets, you support all kinds of policing initiatives, on and on. I hope we're being clear in that how is that, you know, that it feeds on itself, and you don't feel more secure, you end up feeling really anxious.
And you mentioned there are economic interests at work here, but there are also political interests. You know, we're experiencing this in New York right now with the discourse around the subways. You know, New York crime in New York, violent crime, is at historically low levels. The subway is actually significantly safer than city streets in terms of the number of people hours spent there, et cetera. And yet we're bombarded with this politically driven messaging that says we're not safe. How do we end up in this disconnect between these discourses and beliefs about lack of safety and the actual reality?
There's been a lot written on that subject. I mean, for the last, I think I wrote back to you, the last 20 years, the culture of fear. A lot of people put the blame on the media. I put maybe the blame, I'm really interested in social relations. I'm, you know, that kind of anthropologist. So I think a lot of people put the blame on the breakdown in social relations. They put the blame on the segregation of people from one another. They put the blame on downward mobility. They put the blame on crises of capitalism. They put the blame on growing inequality. They put the blame on lack of equity of access to knowledge. I mean, I could turn to you, Alex, and say, what do you blame it? But there is clearly no relationship between the fear, particularly in gating, where I know something. I did a study once where I looked at Johannesburg, where there is really, truly a lot of crime. In all fairness, there's, Mexico City, 25% of all people are assaulted within any 1 year. I mean, that's high crime. And the US, looking at San Antonio and Beijing in China. And the fact is, the discourse of fear and the talking about what it feels like and why they would live in a gated community and how they felt about their everyday lives and how insecure they were was the same, with really dramatically different crime. So it's about other things. It's about ontological insecurity, some people say, right? Could be about anything. I could turn to Alex or Mark, what you think it is, but there are studies that show that it is about something else. So the first question you really want to ask, and I was going to ask you, what do you think the subway is all about? Why are they telling us the subway is dangerous when it's not?
The more recent example of this is, one of the leading mayoral candidates has basically constructed a campaign around a discourse that the city is horribly out of control and that he is the only one who can save it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So first he has to convince us to be afraid when in fact things are objectively actually going quite well, because his claim to fame is that he's going to be the strong man who's going to save us. So I think we have to be alert to those kinds of political discourses. And I think a lot of this is rooted in the fact that a lot of these neoliberal mayors are so committed to austerity and supply-side economics, tax breaks for corporations and the wealthy, and the cutting of essential services, that they want to frame the city's problems as problems of crime and disorder to be managed by policing, because otherwise we might want to tax the rich to pay for housing and health care.
Mm-hmm. You might feel differently.
Well, while I have every sympathy for the good citizens of New York, it's not a unique problem. So my own city of Dublin right now, it's exactly the same discourse. And the discussion is, why are the streets so unsafe? There's politicians saying, I will be the sheriff and I'll clean up this here town, all the usual stuff. But the crime rate is actually quite low. So it may be that there's an awful lot of your list of variables are actually coming together, and there's frankly a chancer trying to make political hay. It's also a very bad strategy. Remember, if you try to say, I'm going to clean up that town, first of all, you may not be able to clean it up. Secondly, it may be clean already, in which case you get blamed when it doesn't improve. I'm thinking of Nicolas Sarkozy in France. He was the tough guy. He's in jail now. So it does turn back, and it's not necessarily the best political strategy. But to my mind, it might be much more low-level phenomena happening as well. Like I said, I work relatively closely with police forces, and you do see this phenomena quite a lot. There is a question about what kind of crime we're actually discussing these days. An awful lot of stuff that we would be talking about, I guess, in our heads is homicide, violent theft, that type of thing. That has plunged. But there's an awful lot of reporting of crime that wouldn't meet the threshold of a crime a number of years ago. It would be sorted out on the ground.
What we call quality of life problems,
exactly.
which has come back as a buzzword in discourse here in New York, revivifying the discredited broken windows theory and the policing that goes along with that.
Yeah. But the only thing that worries, then the question, what's interesting about bringing up the political stakes, which I think is important. We're not saying in TRAP that there aren't political stakes. In fact, in the chapter on New York, the second chapter is about Hudson Yards and development in New York. We do talk about the political stakes, but we still are edging in this book towards the money.
Yeah.
towards, I just want to say.
Yeah, so
you
let's
know, so that's-
transition to
And I don't
that,
know how
yeah.
you feel about, I'd be really curious, you know, how do people feel? I mean, certainly there are political stakes. We're not saying that they're not, but we are also quite concerned that the economics of it are, or the finances of it really drive it. How much is it about industries making money, be them military or security industries or even universities? You know, how much of it is also about the reward of being able to make money out of that fear, not just politically, but also the security capitalism that we're trying to identify.
And let me just slide right in there just before we continue. So then the question becomes, let us imagine this political leader who says, I'm going to clean up the town. Well, what does he or she actually do? I mean, lo and behold, all the solutions these days predominantly are commercial, because you can't recruit more police. That's another problem we might want to come to. It's more CCTV, it's predictive analytics need to be used. You know, we're not going to have more foot patrols, so we need sort of, you know, resource allocation systems. Really, it's not an old-fashioned, pardon the expression, manpower problem, the response. It's going to be something technical and it's going to cost money. So there is a direct connection. When you see the solutions being offered in cities around the world, it's strange, they're always the same solutions. Some consultancy company needs to be paid. The consultancy company also does work with the military. You know, it's just a very small circle. And you can see that in cities that stretch from this wonderful part of the world right the way over to parts of the Middle East and Africa, where there's less of a rule of law. You see those systems being advanced first, almost like a laboratory. So it's a very interesting but straight line that we actually have into security capitalism.
I think one of the important advances that this concept of security capitalism brings us is that it does decenter the state somewhat, right?
Yeah.
What we had prior to this was this discourse around the carceral state. The expansion of punishment bureaucracies and surveillance, but all rooted in state actors, whether it's the police or child protective services or school police forces, et cetera. So you're reminding us that this involves lots of non-state actors. For instance, I think we often forget that the launching of the Black Lives Matter movement was not the result of police violence. It was the result of a kind of self-appointed security agent in a gated community, right?
He was a community watch. He was a community
took
watch
it upon
guy.
himself. So tell us a little bit more about why you think it's important to not limit this analysis to just state actors.
Okay, you start with
I'll start up high, maybe. And I think you might want to talk about that specific example, because it is about gated community.
We'll end there. Okay. Start
But
broad.
yeah, I mean, if I look back to major policing reports that came out even in the 1990s about, you know, the future of policing by Rand, that type of stuff, they all talked about the future of policing going to be semi-private. And again, as anthropologists, we probably are the canary in the coal mine, is that we work in countries where the sharp end of the tail is actually experienced. There's one town and city in South Africa where the local police really don't exist. You call the security service. It's actually, at one point it was called Baywatch, and the police had a panic alarm to call Baywatch, right? Also, it's broken up into kind of a mosaic of gated communities, South Africa, as you well know. So that was already happening for quite a long time. And some people would argue that was the original version of the security provision in the world, was semi-private, basically, or even fully private. But when we get to it now, what's happening is that there's a police station I visited. I worked with the Greater Manchester Police really briefly, just examining some of their technical techniques. But one of their police stations had private security guards protecting it because it abutted a dangerous neighbourhood. When you went inside, there was a handful of police officers. The entire back office was civilian contractors, some of whom were part of a university up the road, and they were doing the technical work. So that vision, that classical vision of the police, has been unbundled, well, with the expression that's used years ago, I think, at this stage. Even my own neighbourhood, you actually just have a button on a wall. There is no police officer. And we can talk maybe about the recruitment issue as part of this, but it has shifted. And I think when we look back at, say, what happened in the instance of Trayvon Martin's death, it wasn't a uniformed agent of the state. It was this new configuration of space, of middle-class desires for safety and fear of downward mobility, and then all sorts of stuff like no sidewalks, right? There was a criminalization of movement.
Right.
Sorry, you know much more about this stuff.
Yeah. I was going to say something about that. Both of us, but particularly me, I'm very interested in space as a method, I guess, as a way of thinking about things. So when I think of a gated community or any kind of, you're thinking again, non-state actor, I'm thinking of any kind of enclosure, right? So any kind of privatized space, be it private, could be a public space that gets privatized, could be a gated community, could be a walled, fortress, whatever, that is an opportunity spatially to surveil in a certain kind of way. And suddenly, whoever is in and whoever is out becomes very visible. I try to make that point really clearly in the book. And suddenly, if you know your neighbors and somebody's walking down the street, and you see that in the interviews, in all of the interviews, and somebody looks different, suddenly there is this kind of panic because it's enclosed and this is something out of place. Mary Douglas used to talk about purity and danger. This is for those students in the audience who, thinking about things being out of place, but that sort of gut feeling, something's out of place. And that isn't something that the state necessarily is implementing. It's the architects and developers and towns, some of whom are state-related, but most of it's privatized. And the other thing that we keep, that it is not, that there is a lot of fear and response to fear with privatization. The more, and I use that term, it's advisedly. I don't always mean just that it's private money, but that it's in the corporate realm, that more and more and more of our safety net, you used the term neoliberalism, which means a restriction of the safety net, things we need for social reproduction, things we need, the parks, that means roads, that means healthcare, all of those things, as they get privatized, they become more exclusive, more gated in a variety of ways, and the state is there, but it's a much more distant element because they have retreated. So in this new world, I guess I'm saying to you, the notion of a carceral state is certainly interesting, but it seems to be only one big piece of the puzzle of the retreat of the state and the coming in of all this privatization or corporate infill, everything from security guards with no policing, and that has created this incredibly different looking world. I don't know if you buy that or not.
No, I think you make a strong case, right, for the role of private economic actors in trying to sell us security. Mm-hmm. Gated communities, fortress malls, surveillance systems for our homes, and also selling the state this machinery. But when we say that this is somehow essentially a capitalist enterprise, I think you're really saying more than just follow the money to a few private security companies. So tell us a little bit more about how you see this more fundamentally related to the kind of ways we've organized our society economically. You mentioned these kinds of austerity measures tied to neoliberalism. So is there something about this selling of security that speaks to these broader ways in which we organize economic relations?
Yeah, I can start with that. Being from Europe, I guess it's less of a shock, if you know what I mean. So historically, capitalism and security were two twins. They always were from the beginning. Both terms actually etymologically tied to France particularly. It's useful just maybe to paint a picture just really quickly, if you don't mind, back through the mists of time. But anybody who wanders about Europe in a lovely tour will notice that it's all walled cities, really. And the walls cease to be important at a certain point. And that's one of
Something
those,
to do with the invention of cannons.
that would be a pretty big issue. But it really wasn't, actually. It wasn't a military thing. It was just they were unnecessary. They were bypassed by economics. So, for example, if you've been to Paris, Paris was a walled city. The walls were not built by the French king. They were built through a process called tax farming. So somebody would have the license to farm taxation from a population of the city, and then their responsibility was to build part of the wall, which is why the walls weren't particularly good, because there were gaps in them, because, such as capitalism. But, that kind of model of almost the strong men raising income and being essentially the security force was really the European model for a very long period of time. In some ways, the punctuation was state security provision. The king's peace was reliant on knights, you know what I mean? So there's always a sense really almost of a return to a different model in Europe. And that's probably even more disturbing, I guess. So it's just important to caveat that history is not, it's not the fall of, something natural. It's right now, I think we're seeing a retrenchment to something just a bit more brutal. And who pays is the safe person. That's probably the bit I just want to get across. Yeah, sorry, I'll throw it.
No, I think you're, I struggle with this question. I don't know. I mean, as I've said before, that I'm really interested in the social relations that we build. And the question is, then for me, what does security capitalism do to the social relations? And then I have to go back to all the things that security capitalism does, because it separates us more and more and more. It reduces the amount of interaction we have with one another. The more weaponry technology we have to protect ourselves from any other person means that there is a whole lot less social interaction. So if you have a public space, which is the other thing other space that I'm really concerned about, and it's heavily securitized. That means that there are police and lots of cameras, and maybe even walls and fences that open and close. That means only certain people will be there. That means that young people of color will probably not go because they don't hang around where the police are. It means that people who don't have a place to sleep probably won't go there either. And suddenly you have this homogenized space, and that ultimately changes social relations. So you have to ask me, does capitalism always create inequality? Yes. Does security capitalism create inequality of who is safe and who is not? Yes. So that the social formation I see is the fragmentation and segregation that I'm so concerned about. But I can't take it, I don't know how to take it farther than that. And I'd look to you to sort of help me on that.
I think Mark has some more to say about it.
I think what we try to do is maybe close that in a different way. So we're not pointing at some nefarious dark group and saying, look what they've done to society. Fundamentally, it's not just about the suppliers, it's about the purchasers. And I think that's what we try to tell the story of throughout this book, is that there are relatively ordinary people living in gated communities, living in urban enclaves. And they're buying this. They're willingly, grabbing hold of this and saying, this is how I want to live. The latter chapters are about relatively ordinary people who work in policing and counterterrorism and in the military complex, who again are just, they're the ones driving this. It's not a mysterious cabal.
Yeah, the big expansion in surveillance technology is individuals buying Ring cameras for their front doors, not the state putting up cameras.
What about the
Yeah, and the Citizen app.
A number of anthropologists are studying the impact of Citizen, in which you can say that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, everybody
Citizen
online.
app.
It's the Citizen app. Maybe actually one of the people working on Citizen app might be out there listening to us. You could probably write in, but the Citizen app is incredible. That's people who want to know where a place is dangerous, and then they send it out to everyone else, and suddenly you have all kinds of rearrangements of space and people. So I think we can find lots.
And politics, right? Because there's been some pretty deep critiques of the Citizen app in driving fear in a misplaced way and implying that the solution is more policing, more surveillance.
Right.
creating a kind of vicious cycle almost.
But there's one more piece of the Trevin Martin story that I always find chilling. And maybe even the recent death of Gene Hackman is kind of chilling too. It's again a gated community. Is that in these very fragmented kinds of spaces where you can easily surveil, individuals take it on themselves to become sort of vigilantes. And we don't talk that much about it. It's actually, we don't talk too much about it in the book, but there's some very good ethnographic work on Bolivia and also in Kenya about vigilantes that arrive. And then certainly we're seeing the rise of vigilantism now, and that's not state-driven. That's people taking the role of the state on themselves, taking it on themselves, right, to enact state power in a new way. And that's really scary too.
But somehow it seems very different than like Jane Jacobs's vision of eyes on the street. You know, if someone, you mentioned the case of Gene Hackman where it appears that his caregiver, his wife, died, he was unable to take care of himself, and no one knew there was a problem.
Right.
But if we had a more integrated community, if we had close neighbors, if we had people who were in the habit of seeing people coming and going in a certain pattern that then is interrupted, that might have alerted someone to intervene. So how can we imagine, you know, these eyes on the street in a more positive, less carceral kind of approach?
Well, gated communities don't necessarily create community. That's, if my older work, I've pretty well established that. There are gated communities that work. Don't really, you can all find one that works. And I think they work better for retirees, say in Florida, probably. Those are not the ones I'm so concerned about. I'm mostly concerned about gated communities where families and children are growing up, because those children become convinced that anybody outside the gates are dangerous. You're creating generations of kids that think anybody outside is dangerous. But I mean, the real question is, how do we stop isolating ourselves? What is this flee from one another? I used to not believe the bowling alone, but the new data coming in, which is that associations are pulling apart and that people are moving farther and farther. But certainly with media and virtual and the COVID and all of that, we all have to agree that social relations are getting frayed. And so, you know, my remedy is not everybody else's remedy. I really am an activist for public space. I mean, I know that I really feel that we need public spaces and face-to-face interaction, because as far as the evidence goes, it's only with mutual aid and face-to-face interaction and knowing your neighbor do you really and truly make any difference in fear. And yet the trend, privatization drives it. I have to say, I think security capitalism, other kinds of capitalism drive it, driving us away from a model that may sound old-fashioned, maybe, I don't know, even corny, I admit, but the fact is the evidence is still there. Knowing people makes you feel safer. All the way back to the 80s, Sally Mary's work on urban danger is if you're acquainted with people, you're much less likely to feel afraid, and you're much more likely to feel you know, that you have people there and that you're not alone.
Some sense of
So
solidarity.
how do we do that in our current privatized, segregated, unequal, you know, society? How do we do that? How do we recreate that?
Yeah, well, the state is actively trying to undermine it.
That
Yes.
doesn't help.
Yeah. So,
What about, I keep thinking in Ireland, maybe. In Ireland, maybe.
Well, I mean,
In Ireland, the
I'm
people
not
are
sure
better.
I would imagine an Irish family is the safest place, or an Irish neighborhood. But yeah, I get the point. I mean, if we're actively, this is the tone of the conversations, we're actively pulling in the wrong direction. That's very different from me saying maybe a balance needs to be struck. But yeah, it's, you know, if you're in a situation where the wall is already built, it's very hard to go backwards. That's the tricky bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so throughout the book, you know, you raise these very powerful objections to the rise of these apparati of security, including thinking that if we just further militarize the police, further empower the police, that somehow this is going to set us free, that this is going to solve our problem. So you have this deep critique of these institutions, and the one closest to me, policing. But in the end, you imagine a kind of reform of these institutions in a way that allows them to be more targeted on the right problems, let's say. But my question is it really possible to have a truly sort of just form of policing when we live in a system that is so tied to systems of exploitation, where there is so much inequality, where those institutions of surveillance and law enforcement and social control have become so central to maintaining those systems of exploitation?
Well, we don't answer that question fully with the book, but I mean, we do quote a very senior member of the London Met Police, writing in 1927, who attempted to wrestle with this issue. And by the way, he was no progressive, but he pointed out something I think that is true then as it is today, which is that policing in its modern classical form, shall we say, is the imposition of a social order. And if you have a society that grants equal rights to everybody, and those people, be they minorities, women, etc., demand safety from the police in a public space, well, then the police actually is dysfunctional by definition. It can't do that. It's not set up to do that. So there's a deep crisis there, and I know your work has been tracking this. I probably track it in a slightly different way, and I might just go off-piste on this. I think policing is in crisis for a number of other reasons. I mean, first of all, you can't get any these days. I spent 6 months in rural France 2 years ago. I never once saw a police car at any point in 6 months. Because there's no police in France, there's no gendarme. Their numbers look great until you realize there's a 30% recruitment shortfall. The London police did 30%-ish, 1/3, so 33% down for the police service in Northern Ireland. Those police who join are gone within 4 or 5 years mostly. So we're running out of police officers, actually. And no matter what law and order person is in charge, they can't wield a tool that no longer exists. At some point, even in my own country, which is about 20% shortfall, somebody's going to pick up the phone and there'll simply be no response at all. So I don't think if I gave, in my thinking at any point, a sense that this was reformable, I think it's in crisis in a multiplicity of different ways. And we're just not clear on what's going to replace it. Our fear is that it's going to be replaced by essentially private providers. That will be the dominant form.
And they're worse.
They're potentially worse, yes, but I think that...
I'm curious as to why you said potentially.
Yeah.
Well, potentially worse. So here's the thing, is that if we look historically, right, we had private policing before we had public policing. So in Pennsylvania in the late 1800s, we had a huge amount of labor strife in the coal fields and the iron fields, and the mine and factory owners tried to use private guards to manage that, which resulted in massacres and human rights abuses and a legitimacy crisis. So they turned to the state and said, we need something different. So they weren't ready for a public police yet, so they created the coal and iron police, which were basically deputized by the state, with the miners paying like $1 fee for each person. And the abuses continued, the legitimacy, until finally they created a public police. But that public police was modeled on the colonial forces that the U.S. were employing in the Philippines at that time. They brought people back, and it had the patina of state legitimacy and public funding, but it still continued to serve the same purpose. So what I see is that when we turn to privatization, eventually we're going to have more Trayvon Martins and more kinds of abuses of private policing, which will cause private interests to try to bring the state back in to insulate it. and also to cover the bills. So I think we're caught in a vicious cycle, in essence, with this. And for me, the question is, how do we get out of it? And I think we have to try to make the case about other ways to provide safety for people, which do exist, but are not always in keeping with core, like, capitalist priorities.
Right. I mean, this is true. This is right. We need more mutual aid. We need to foster social relations. And the way we're going right now, as I said, with the privatization and corporatization of everything, including our housing and how we live and everything, that's not going to happen. So it would have to be a rethinking. I mean, I think that the only, quote, way out has always been to create security for all. And I started this thing saying that everyone wants to feel safe and secure. This is nothing wrong with that. The question is, we no longer have a society that provides that. And if it is provided at all, it's purchased by the few. So, but what you're saying is really very interesting, is that so private security comes in and fails, and they're going to bring in the public again, and it's just a cycle. So it is a problem. Profit-driven security is a problem.
But if that is true, I mean, that's the critical issue. Where are these people coming from that are going to, ride to our rescue when private security fails? So I'm doing some research at the moment on military recruitment in British military towns, like Aldershot and places like that. Aldershot has a 300% decline in recruitment. That's the home of the British Army, 300% over the last 7 years. So when you go into the key ethnographic categories, kids, you say to them, well, why don't you want to join the army? It's the stigma for a lot of people. But mostly they'll say, I'm not going to die doing that. And that's the same thing people, when you talk to them about policing, they are unwilling to, this is a really strange knot we get into, right? It's because of social solidarity being hollowed out, the idea of sacrificing yourself for the social gets lost too. So I think we're doing more damage than we think, frankly. So I would nearly reverse. I think the solution to the crisis is actually in building the solidarity now, rather than letting the systems work themselves out. I don't think they're going to. Maybe I'm just more, I have less sense of hope than perhaps you've articulated,
Well, I think there are lots of ways for people to make sacrifices and take risks to try to produce public good. And I think about the emergence of the kind of community-based anti-violence movement across the United States, in which credible messenger violence interrupters are out on the streets working in high violence communities with young people who are carrying guns and things like that. And they are taking tremendous risks and making huge sacrifices, and yet their funding is cut. They are harassed by the police for trying to stop the violence in a different way. So I think we need to look at those examples. I think we need to unleash a lot of experiments and make some demands about what the principles should be that guide our desire for safety. How do we produce safety in ways that provide people as much dignity as possible, that does as little harm as possible? And I think we could find a lot of career paths for young people that might be more appealing and are just as good or even better at actually producing safety for people.
And in the last chapter of the book, I mean, when we wrote the book, we really wanted to provide some solutions.
Sure.
And I think I was just rereading it. It's good. It reads really well.
Yes.
Doesn't go far enough.
Well,
I mean, I'm sorry.
we all feel that way at the end of a book project.
Yeah,
we all feel that way.
It's already a year later. But there's some other things where I am suggesting that there are lots and lots of countries that do not allow gated communities. You cannot develop gated communities. They're illegal. Now, that doesn't mean some people don't put up a wall here and there. It's actually against the law in Mexico. I mean, there's still some. So there are things. You can think through development. I mean, I'm convinced, I really am convinced, that social relations are really influenced by the built environment. You heard me, you know, I am, and through space. So, and we write about security scapes, and these security scapes are physically imprint on the ground, and they stay. So what about really, you know, saying to developers, no, we can't have that kind of impenetrable space, you know, changing the way we do development, rethinking our education, and thinking about the landscape, or at least the built environment, in ways that would open up the possibilities for social solidarity. I have two colleagues here who are both, you know, architects and planners, and I can see a smile on one face, like that's really, but if you want to think about solutions, I think we have to think about solutions at every single level. I do, both in terms of thinking psychologically. I think the media needs to be taken to task for, you know, there was a kidnapping in San Antonio during the time I was doing field work. It was a little girl, and it was tragic. It was horrible. There were 75 articles over the next month about this one incident. It so exaggerated, blew it up, that every single mother was panicked. That is not necessary. This is not necessary. So there are really smaller kinds of things that we can be doing that could lay a groundwork for the kind of, you know, a kind of society where we would be lowering the sense of fear.
I think I've got time for one more question for you. And you mentioned colleagues in other fields, but the university right now is in a kind of complex place. On the one hand, you know, we're being attacked for being too liberal, too diverse, too DEI, too woke. But on the other hand, you point out just how complicit the university has been in producing this politics of fear and this technology of surveillance and the false promise of it all. So what are our obligations as academics? How do we respond in this very complex environment?
Well, I'll start in Europe and I'll travel across the Atlantic to answer. So in Europe, as was the case study, the last chapter, there's a very particular history post 9/11 of an investment in a Europe-wide security infrastructure. And it was very deliberately bringing major global arms companies to the table and recruited universities. Now, much like the United States, they're in, say, countries like Germany, there are free universities, sometimes castigated as pacifist universities, and then there's institutes that are much more compliant, like Fraunhofer, for example, which, I mean, Germany has a big arms industry and a big security surveillance industry. But in Europe, we've always put that over there, you know, kind of behind a veil. Sort of like, you know, the old sausage factory thing. You don't really want to know how it's made. You know, where's a leopard tank from? I don't know. You know, this kind of thing. But it's coming together now, obviously, consequent with the war in Ukraine. And now the investment in, and it's not just military and defense, it is security systems. They're interoperable with Homeland Security. It's now in the hundreds and hundreds of billions. And then we put it together. The European security industrial complex is bigger than the Russian and Chinese one. But then we look at America. 860 billion was the last appropriation figure. Put that together with all the other elements that are more security than straightforward defense, and it's 1.4 trillion. Now we're asking ourselves, can we have alternative solutions about building social solidarity? That's where the money is. And it's in percentages of GDP.
Defund the military.
Well, yeah, it's very unpopular to say these things in some quarters in Europe because of these colleagues, actually, who are very hawkish in many cases and are trying to push universities down this direction and developing dual-use technology. But I would say this. When people ask me, as I have been asked this several times, you know, you're against these kind of militarization, securitization projects in university. What do we do to defend ourselves, right? It's a little bit like, isn't that film Unforgiven? I'd be left at the mercy of my enemies, you know? But look at what they're spending the money on. Half this stuff isn't going to make anybody secure. A colleague of mine was a reviewer for a project that was about sending unmanned robots out into the Finnish wilderness to look for Russian spies or something, armed. an armed robot. And, you know, and the people making this stuff were laughing at it. And they were saying, well, you know, obviously this doesn't work, but maybe in 10 years we'll come up with a gizmo. They're, pardon my language, but they're screwing the system, these companies. And, you know, if I was going to cut waste, fraud, and abuse, I know where I'd start. Put it that way.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I actually find that the we've always fought against military funding of universities, and it's always been funded by the military, and we don't spend enough time, I would say, as academics talking about it. That's a continuing conversation, I think. I think it's a really, really serious issue that kind of goes by the wayside. Those of you out there who are students, that could come up that, you know, where is our money coming from? Here at CUNY, I was said to Mark, maybe it's not so much, but I don't even know that.
We're not quite a free university in the European sense, but freer than some
In
of
Columbia.
our colleagues here in Manhattan, yes. And I think it played a role, frankly, in the intolerance around dissent that we witnessed last year, was that there were actually, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in research contracts that were implicated, and not just in the STEM field, but also people producing ideologies and game plans and justifications for all of this.
And there's one thing that, sorry, I'm the most depressing guest you've ever had in CUNY, but just to make it even darker, one phenomena, just as we've lost a certain category of security provider at the bottom of the pyramid, there's a real oddity about the top. We've a finite supply of nerds in the world. So as this race to AI, you know, has taken hold, with hundreds and hundreds of billions being put on the table on both sides of the Atlantic, it's not really tolerable to have freewheeling, free-thinking, AI-capable intellectuals just hanging around in pacifist universities. They're going to get hoovered up because that's where the big grant money is going to be. That's where the career opportunities are going to be. So there is a very straight line here. There's a magnetic force being on this at the moment.
Capitalist imperatives. All right, we have time for a handful of questions, hopefully. Now we're using microphones so the people listening in can hear us. So why don't we start up front here, and then we'll try and work our way around. So right here. And just hold it fairly close.
Have you got any findings or thoughts on how the security capitalism relates to fertility rates around the country, or wage gaps between mothers and fathers, how this relates to, yeah, there you go.
Interesting question. Mark, thoughts?
The most obvious stuff wouldn't be this part of the world, but certainly I think both of us would have worked overseas in areas in which, say, basic human security is lacking, and therefore, for example, young women, when they wish to go to work in parts of Nairobi, would band together and use app technology to track each other and stuff like that. So that there's an odd form of solidarity and communality about these things, but it's also being exploited to some degree. How it affects fertility, I mean, I can only guess that it might have an impact on family life generally, but that whole fertility crisis, to me, is obviously very real. There's a massive decline in the birth rate. It's really become a right-wing flag-waving exercise at the moment in very disturbing ways. I spent 2015 part of it in Hungary, which seems to be leading the charge to rebirth that part of the world. But that's a very unusual phenomenon.
While people are, you know,
dying,
begging to be let in
literally
to work
dying.
to help, you know, revivify these societies. So yeah, cruel ironies there. So this gentleman in the striped shirt right on the aisle.
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. I'm wondering on your thoughts on how cars play into security capitalism. Like, I'm thinking of car culture in Cairo, but just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
I can start if you. I don't know if I can fully answer it, but there's a couple of things I've noticed just as part of field work. Obviously, policing became automobile driven a long time ago in the United States, but nowadays in parts of France where I would have worked, you find the police patrol is not just reactive, but it's almost like a kind of Iraq-style convoy that passes through a neighborhood. And they say that because they're under threat, they're feared. So there's this kind of, so if you're in one car, they try to tempt you out, and then they'll burn the car. So they go 2 cars, and then suddenly you need 3 cars to watch the 2 cars. You know the way this joke goes, if you know what I mean. So that can be very disconcerting if you're living in a neighborhood in which the police presence can be a little bit threatening, but then you're seeing an armed police convoy for no apparent reason, sometimes turning up to a domestic dispute. So there's that kind of reactive piece, and distancing, I think, occurs. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is just, sorry, just to share with you, I trained in close protection, and I was sharing this with Setha recently. So I've been in kind of VIP convoys, and that's an amazing experience too, because those people who kind of really afford security do tend to kind of move through the world differently. It is the F. Scott Fitzgerald anniversaries, but like the rich are not like you and I, you know. But that's fascinating to me too, that kind of mobility, pushing other traffic to one side, you know, the inner world of the car, the jet, etc. So there's that kind of transportation elitism is, I think, part of the security story. Sorry, I'm just telling stories now. Just not.
Yeah, Jesse, I don't know exactly where you were trying to get at. Are you thinking about cars kill so many people? Is that more what you're thinking about?
Well, are people
No.
thinking that cars bring us somehow like security and freedom?
I see.
And so
Okay,
then we
that's where
build
you're
our
going.
cities around car usage, but in fact, cars are quite dangerous. They're one of the leading causes of death and pollution and all the rest. And in fact, public transit is much safer and more democratic.
That's where you were going. All right.
So in the back right next to you, yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Hey. I just want to look at that, because I know Setha's work
Yeah,
on
this,
gated
oh, it's
community.
Cecile. I can't see you.
Yes. About gated communities. Did you look at the outside, people who are not secured, like people who are not buying these apps, they are not inside the gated communities, in the over-protected communities, and the way the over-securization is injuring the rest of the city.
Absolutely.
And I want to add this, I don't know, I have to, like in September, I was in Palestine, and all of these illegal settlements, they are the extreme of a gated community. Yeah. Like the only thing you get out is a creek of sewage coming from the gated communities going into the fields of the Palestinians. And also, like if you drive, forget about Google Maps or Waze or any of those, because they will take you to the most convenient road, which is the settlement road. And if you are a Palestinian, you are dead. So you cannot even use those apps because they're not made for people who are outside the secured zones.
And that's true in Beirut, too. Those of you who know about Beirut, it's you have to drive the city. There's some wonderful ethnography also about the secure city, that who you are determines where you can drive. But yeah, I never did as much research outside the gated communities as I wanted, but I did do often the commercial area and the communities right there. And actually, gating often creates tremendous animosity and a sense of social distance and social difference. Not so much that anybody's been able to vote out gating that I know of, but yeah, it highlights this idea of the have and the have-not. So it's deleterious in that way, and certainly to social relations.
Okay, in the sweater here.
Oh, dear.
Yes.
Well, first, thank you very much. Fascinating, intriguing topic, and a great session, so thank you. It took about an hour of discussion before I heard the word psychological come out. I believe Professor Lowe mentioned it. I think there's an elephant in the room, so to speak, in that, well, first of all, one ought not to be surprised that the discussion focused mostly on macro level, social, socioeconomic, political factors. I mean, we have 2 anthropologists and a sociologist, okay? So can't be faulted for that. It's reasonable. But a number of times you came up against the notion of what I think what Professor Maguire referred to as the purchases, let's say the demand side of the equation. All of the discussion has been about the supply side. Very little was said, and I think probably for good reason, because we don't know a hell of a lot about people's fear and how that fear is magnified, and how it exists way beyond the real-life statistical incidence of the events. I mean, all it takes is one poor guy getting shoved on the subway tracks, you know, and people's blood pressure goes up for 2 weeks, and so there's a real question of dealing with that other side of the equation of people's fear, and I don't think we're going to be able to solve this issue until we focus on that part of the algorithm.
But Joel, there is work on the psychology of fear and where it comes from, and especially during 9/11, there was an incredible amount written on the psychology of fear and how fear can be augmented. And there is also the literature, what's our colleague at the University of Chicago, Masco, who writes about that Americans in particular, again, it's about the US, were trained in fear during the 50s when we were...
Duck and cover.
Yeah, duck and cover. And I was old enough to duck and cover in school. And that the psychological training of fear has been repeated a number of times in American history. And how is it, how will the fear be ameliorated? I think knowing each other, but we disagree on this. This is my husband, so we don't agree.
To be continued at dinner. So I think there was another hand on this side. No? Okay, right over here then. Just.
Thank you. I hope I can articulate this well, but I think I agree with everything you've brought up. I think an elephant in the room is following the money from the government side in terms of the NRA paying off Congress to look the other way on gun violence. And then, of course, the press exacerbates it. And I think that's a real overlooked portion of your studies, elephant in the room, if you will. It bothers me that they can get away with that kind of money just purchasing freedom from any kind of restrictions on buying guns. They get into the hands of people that are not very level-headed or maybe upset about stuff. And on the opposite side of that, we have the same government disrupting everybody and pissing everybody off, and the journalists exacerbating that too. So you don't have any, you got money buying Congress, no gun control, and you've got people buying guns that are pissed off. So that, to me, that's
we don't deal with
a very
good point.
The volatile combination.
It's an elephant in your room.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with gated communities or those outside and those inside. That affects everybody that walks around. You know?
I'm sure there's a lot of gun ownership in these gated communities.
Yeah, but it depends on the state, not New York. I mean, so San Antonio is really different than New York, than gated communities. And Mexico City is really different, you know, from Puerto Rico. So it varies with the area.
Sorry to interrupt, Setha. I did read an article that the visa applications from the U.S. citizens, probably a lot of us with money, have risen 4,000%. And when
This is applications for people to leave the U.S. and go somewhere else.
get out,
Yeah.
absolutely, 4,000%. I don't know what the numbers are. They may have gone from 40,000 to 200,000. I'm not sure what that, but it's 40%. So when they're asked, why are you applying for a visa to leave? Number one was the safety of their kids.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Which again had nothing, it's about the schools. It's not even about a gated community.
Let's see if we can take one or two more. Yeah, we got one right over here. Right over here, and I think actually that might have to be the last one.
Yeah, I see Karen.
Yep.
Karen is moving
Yes.
slowly up.
Thank you for the interesting discussion. I actually have two questions. First, I was wondering if you distinguished between different forms of violence, because of, according to Pierre Bourdieu, there is symbolic violence, which we have accepted to a certain extent, like epistemic violence, for example. And so do you believe that fear is always a bad thing because it might lead to a lack of action and a lack of resistance as well? Is fear sometimes that can help as well? And the second question is, according to Yuval Noah Harari, the historian, there are topics such as migration that are used to create a lot of fear as well, because we might be affected, we might lack something like wealth or something like that, and they may take something away from us. Whereas there are other topics, such as the climate crisis, which do not have the same discourse, because first it is neglected to a certain extent, but also we have contributed to the climate. All of us have contributed to a climate crisis. So it's kind of all of our fault. So there are different issues that might be used or instrumentalized by politicians to create a lot of fear, whereas other topics are not touched at all. You know what I mean?
I can start, yeah. So I actually might just respond kind of to a couple of questions into that particularly. So all your elephants in the room are real elephants, I want to assure you of that. Well, actually the last chapter of the book is about a lobbyist, so we actually try to deal with this question. Just on the fear element, it's come up so much in this conversation today. I think we tried in the text to point out that it's not just members of the public vis-a-vis the state or companies. They're also ordinary, everyday, sometimes very decent people that work in the security sector, either in parallel with it or directly. And they too have strange fears, actually. So one of the things we record in the book is the story of counterterrorism in one particular British airport, and a guy who was trying to just be a police officer in a very old-fashioned way, but got caught up in this fear economy. And it simply works like this. He's the counterterrorism training officer for a very large airport. He had to buy into all the fear-mongering. Right, there's not going to be a terrorist attack in this guy's airport. It was the IRA, I think, tried to blow up a car there in the 70s or something. It's not a serious issue, but it came in his entire job. And there was all these academic discourses about how to spot radicals, this kind of stuff. So he dealt with a very different type of fear. He didn't believe everything was going to come crashing down, but he was responding to a kind of a pseudo-fear in his everyday life. And eventually left, actually, and became a human rights barrister, but that's a separate story. But, so we're dealing with multiplicity of different types of fear, and some of them are real, some of them are imagined. But you're absolutely right, your word is correct. They can be instrumentalized. And, I don't want to add an even more depressing tone here, so I won't. But when you have professionals working in a fear economy or in a fear-based sector, you're going to get some of these types of issues. Sorry, I'm going to cut myself off there.
We have, I'd love to talk, but we have to stop.
So thank you so much for coming out. Setha and Mark are going to sign books out in the lobby, so please purchase a book, and you can have additional questions with them.
And thank you, Alex.
Yeah, we'll be out
Pleasure.
front. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex, Karen, Mark. Thank you, audience. You were terrific. And we don't even get to see who all was online, so that's always fun.